So I thank you for being here. I thank you for letting your film join sort of a journey of learning. And if you would like to just introduce it for a minute or so before we let people speak.
Yeah, I'll just take a minute to tell you how the film began. It was in 1982. What was happening, but 1981, 1982, what began to happen in Bombay, and this, I should tell you, was the beginning of the liberalization era in India, the change from mixed economy, socialists and capitalists, to a different idea with the pressure coming from the IMF and the World Bank. It was the time when the Asian Games were held in Delhi, and color TV came to India for the first time. And it was also the time when the whole system, the public enterprise began to be questioned. Privatization became, it was the early days of pushing for privatization. And what happened in the city of Bombay, as in other big cities, was that the city was gearing itself for foreign investment. They wanted to attract foreign capital. It must have happened in Bangalore as well. I'm sure you know that scenario better. But in Bombay, it was very visible that one of the first things that when you want foreign capital is that you get embarrassed about the poor. So Bombay was embarrassed about its poor. It was it thought, the government of the day thought that we should now do demolitions. We should actually send the poor back where they came from. Basically, we don't want them in the city. But you can't actually wish them away. And so there were many unsuccessful attempts to demolish homes. I mean, I'm not saying the demolitions were unsuccessful, but they didn't actually succeed in throwing people out. They even went to the extent of actually putting people on a train and sending them back to the south and wherever they thought they came from. But that didn't work. People came back to the city. Demolitions, by and large, are done. It's obvious that the demolitions don't make the people disappear. They just shift them slightly. Because what happens in a demolition is that people move to another spot and then come back to the same spot if they can, or move to wherever else they might be able to stay. One of the reasons why, and I learned this as I began making the film, is why the city does these demolitions is because they think that if they don't do demolitions, then people get tenure. Because once a slum is not disturbed for a while, they get rights. And this is to prevent people from having any concept of rights, that to make them realize that, you know, you can live here, but you can't say this is not your residence, so this doesn't belong to you. Anyway, so in Bombay, on a big scale, demolitions began, and I was initially part of the PUCL, the People's Union for Civil Liberties, trying to fight for the right to shelter. We argued, along with the Lawyers Collective, we filed a case in the Supreme Court saying that the right to shelter is an extension of the right to life. If you're not allowed to live anywhere, then how do you have the right to life? While this case was being argued, the Supreme Court gave a stay order and stopped demolitions in Bombay. So this film, I actually started out taking photographs initially just to help the PUCL to build their case and going to the slums and taking pictures. But eventually I had just got a new second-hand camera, and 16 millimeter, and so I thought that might as well put it on film. And so I started filming along those lines. And the film took about 3 years to complete. So it was finished in 84, 85. And yeah, the rest we'll talk of after you see the film. If the film has no commentary, it's basically Bombay, our city, meaning who is the we. So it's basically the people who live in slums and the people who live in so-called legal housing.
One of our ongoing projects here has, is concerned very much with documenting the ongoing cycles of eviction and demolition in Indian cities. So what struck me so immediately about the film is 30 years later, how contemporary it feels, just how immediate it feels. Bangalore has just seen the evictions of 15,000 households from Ejipura near Koramangala in order to pave way for a mall. Golbari is on in Bombay as we speak. Our work has looked at 217 evictions in Delhi between 1990 and 2007, very much that period we were looking for. So one of the things that, I look at this film that, in some sense has the textures of being from another time, but think of it so much as, I wonder if you think you would if you made this film today, would it be very different? Would you make it very differently? Do you think that the story would actually, what parts of it would change, what parts of it would stand?
Yeah, I mean, to tell you that when I made this film, the people who lived in non-legal housing slums were about 50% in Bombay. And today they're 67%. So there's only 33% people live in actual legal housing. And legal in the sense only what they claim to be legal, actually, they've all bought their money in black. So there's nothing legal. So it's just a matter of how you look at it. So the slum issue is much bigger than it used to be. What might have changed is that the level of street protests that you saw in this film, perhaps now is restricted to some areas where people like Medha Patkar's Ghar Bachao, Ghar Banao Andolan, Simpreet and the people who are fighting with that movement are still very active. But taking the fight to the street has become much more difficult in this day than it used to be. For one thing, you can't even demonstrate in Bombay legally anymore. You're not allowed, there's no place where the city allows large demonstrations, unless they're like Raj Thakra's demonstration or Bal Thakra's demonstrations. I mean, ordinary demonstrations like slum dwellers would be, you have to go to a small little corner in Azad Maidan where it fits about, 10,000, not even 10,000 people in that fenced off area. That's the only legitimate place where people are allowed to gather. They can't even get there in a big rally. They have to come by train or bus or whatever.
There's a policing very much of public space.
So there's complete sort of crackdown on any visible signs of protest.
And what do you think, why do you think that is? Do you think that that in this new economic moment that you considered, has there in a sense been a breaking of movements and coalitions? Is it just the policing of space is clearly one technique by why this has happened? But what do you think is behind the fact that you think resistance has actually weakened in some ways?
For the multiple reasons. I mean, the whole idea of neoliberal economy has taken root. I mean, in 1980s, mid-80s, that was the beginning. So there was still sort of people who had other ideas, and now those are in a terrible minority, while it's the complete consent amongst the elite classes, but even amongst the middle classes, that the only form of development is having big bazaars and malls.
You think there's a certain hegemony that discourse has taken, that has been internalized?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I have many more things to ask you, but I'm going to do a round. I'll take 2 or 3 questions together.
The thing is that in the last 30 years, there have also been many other films about demolitions, and not only independent documentary films, but to some extent the mainstream television also, reproduces images like this and sort of mainstreams and tames those images, so then to some extent they lose their power also. So I don't know if you can answer this easily, but would you make it differently? I mean, and also, would it be addressing a different audience if you made a film today? I mean, you show your films around a lot in slums,
Yeah.
And you've said that, that's your real audience, and screenings like this are. But if you made it today, would it be different?
In a way, I have made it today. In the sense, I made Jai Bhim Comrade, which is directly linked to this film because the same person who sings the song in this film is the beginning of of Jai Bhim Comrade, because he committed suicide in 1997. The Vilas Gogre who sang the main song that runs through this film, and that's an exploration of again slums, but we're looking at the Dalit community, which is a big majority in the slums also. I don't know if I would make it very differently. No, I don't think so. Probably my access to the elite classes would be more restricted now because they know what I'm up to. So, yeah. So they may not, and they speak a more sophisticated language than what you hear in 1980, mid 80s. And they won't upfront say things, possibly.
You know, one of the things that has changed in terms of different kinds of approaches, especially from within movements, to talk about questions of housing. You take the example, say, of the National Slum Dwellers Federation, Spark and Mahila Milan, that works out of poor communities in Bombay, who in one way really tried to scale a program where they tried to change the engagement of the state of the poor to one of sort of a tense but surviving cooperation. Whereas, you know, in some sense we said that this eternal fight against the state isn't something that's survivable. Now, the National Alliance of People movements has, in many ways, that there has been a tension within movements also to think about what kind of ally the state can be and what kind of relationship what can have with the state. Because in the end, the claims of the protest and the claims of rights have to be directed to an entity that may provide them. Right? And rights claims are inevitably in India still directed to the state.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in India we have the critical paradox where even though information, education, and possibly food rights have been won, the right to housing and the right to shelter, as you point out, remains conspicuously absent from Constitution. There is no larger framework of a right to housing that we can draw upon. Given, in some sense, what you describe as this neoliberal moment, what kind of perspective do you think, what kind of ally do you think the state can be? Or are we still pitted in a place where we are in this sort of fractious resistance? Or do you think there's some possibility to find a new way to relate to our urban local bodies, to our public institutions?
See, when you launch a struggle, you always have to posit the idea that the state can do something. You can't sort of give up on the state and say, no, then you say, wait for the revolution, you know, which is, you know, that's unfair to the people who are suffering right now. So I think that, I mean, I'll take the example of, say, Ghar Bachao, Ghar Banao, or Medha's movement, which is constantly fighting the state, unlike, say, Spark, which is in a collaboration with the state. I mean, trying to, and not just collaboration with the state, but also collaboration with many of the funding bodies that put money in for urban development. And that has its own contradiction, because that is part of the problem. It's not really the solution, because the point is that the state is so incredibly corrupt that no matter what scheme that sounds good on paper, it never materializes like that on the ground. So, for instance, the SRA scheme. The SRA scheme is riven with complete corruption. I mean, you have people who you employ goons to make the legitimate claimants run off, and somebody else gets the land, gets the flat, and that's what the Andolan has been fighting. And so the latest possible thing to ask for is, say, the Rajiv Awas Yojana, which is what the Ghar Bachao people are asking for. Even that is not being granted, because the Rajiv Yojana seems to be too radical even for the state that proposed it. So they don't want to implement that. And basically that would transfer power to the people themselves to become the developers, and not give it to a builder to build these places up. So yeah, I don't have the answer for that. I think that agitation and constructive thing has to keep on going together. There's no one or the other way of doing it. I wouldn't change the climax. Not that I think that either the government in Bengal was a workers' rule, nor the government in the Soviet Union was workers' rule. It may have been in the very beginning, nor is the government in China workers' rule, even though that was the intention. So I think that all of these states are deteriorated from their ideal. And what we are watching is the deterioration part of it. But I wouldn't throw the ideal out while I would question the practice of it. I would question, even in the conception of the communist state, I would question many things. But I wouldn't chuck out the idea, because I think the idea is what sustains those movements from hoping and fighting for a better world, which is what they're doing. So when they express the worker state, it's not a very concrete idea of how that is to come about. It's a poetic idea of justice.
Okay. I'm sure when you made this film, you were deeply affected by this issue, and which is why you actually went about filming this. And my question is, did this film change anything, or did it achieve anything that you actually wanted to change or achieve?
Oh, well, I can tell you a few concrete examples, but they're actually, in a sense, they're the exception that proves the rule. The rule is that there are more slums today than before. There's more demolitions than before. But in a in small, tiny way, things did change at the time. For instance, when this film was made, it won a national award. It got on TV, but the demolitions continued. So even the places that I'd filmed got demolished after I had won national award, etc., etc. And when that happened, in one of the slums in Kolaba, the place that you see in the film quite often, they were thrown out and they were on the footpath, and I went on hunger strike with 3 slum dwellers to demand alternate housing for the slum. Even if they're to be demolished, they should be given another plot of land. And what had happened before was that Shabana Azmi had seen this film, and she wanted to help in some way or the other. And when she heard that we were on hunger strike on the street, she joined the hunger strike. And when she joined the hunger strike, it became national news. It became, every day it was on the headlines, because she was a big star. And so 5 days later, the government couldn't take the pressure and they gave in. They got, and those people are living in Goregaon, in another place called Sangash Nagar, which was a plot of land that the government gave to rehabilitate this slum. So that's a tiny success story, but it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't change anything in the long run.
This film was, I'd taken it across for a friend, and this young boy saw it. I think it just, what I felt was, it gave him a connection, because he realized that you could, without feeling abashed, talk about your concern for things like this. So I think it made, so I think that is also something concrete. Hello?
See, the thing that I wanted to talk about, for instance, the way the film is structured and how, why is it that I do a crude thing like talk to the rich and talk to the poor and things like that? It's because I was confronted while I was dealing with the subject with people who completely were unabashedly, for them, it was not just, the poor was not just a class issue. It was almost a racist idea of the poor. It was almost like these were not the same kind of people as us. These were lazy and unintelligent, and they deserve what they got. And that is, so I think that in our country especially, maybe because we have a caste system, which is historically we've been saddled with, that we have internalized the idea that class is God-given and and those who are at the bottom of it deserve what they get. And so I think in many ways the film definitely challenges that idea. Whether people who watch it know it or not, it's chipping away at that belief.
And I just want to add to that. I think the other thing that's very important to think about in a film like this is that the difference in reading empirical data on demolitions, reading numbers or policy reports, thinking about, and the difference between hearing the way in which people that one recognizes and can see in one's own living room or seen across the street, and hearing the way people think about how they actually manage such close proximity to inequality is actually a question every Indian faces. How do we actually continue to live every day, and how does inequality continue to socially reproduce itself every day? Why don't things actually fall apart? Why isn't there revolution? And I think there are, and different people in different ways have different logics here. So the municipal commissioner is holding on to this idea that there is rule of law. There must be rule of law. There is this thing called the master plan. And when Ghar Bachao Andolan, Banao Andolan, or PUCL or the Stop Evictions campaign in Delhi went to the courts against demolitions, this is what we were told. The judges said, how can you ask us to set aside law? How can we as defense, didn't you say we were the last institution that works? And and so that the rule of law is another way of distancing. It's another way, because the consequences of illegality for the rich and the poor are not the same. And we just did Akrama Sakrama in Bangalore that regularized and legalized illegal colonies of the rich. 1,700 colonies in Delhi were legalized in one shot. But regularization happens for unauthorized colonies, which aren't ever called illegal colonies. They're unauthorized. Right? Even in the naming and the words and the practices, we distinguish in those legalities. I think one of the things about films, particularly these languages, are to notice these ways of the culture of poverty, the almost racialized difference, but also things aren't that obvious, which is, I'm a municipal planner, I must enforce the law. Right? So I think these distinctions are so important, and they come across in these ways. Last question.
Okay. There are far more images that you see in the media, news channels, everybody going in there and getting out. So do you think that we've become more insensitive to these images now? And secondly, the stories also that come out, they are essentially saying the same thing, but the way it's put across in the media these days, has it changed?
Let's take the example of, say, Slumdog Millionaire, right? It's located in the slum. It does in some ways what Bombay our city does, or it goes and shows the seamy side of life, the actual conditions. At the same time, it has so many safety valves for the elite. It has so many ways in which you don't really have to worry. What are the ways that it does that? It does that by locating the cause and effect in the same area. That means the poor are their own enemies. Meaning the slum dwellers are in that condition because they do it to themselves. They blind their own children, make them beg, they cut off hands. You can't have any sympathy for that beggar on the street because he's obviously done it to himself, or his parents did it to himself and sold him into beggary. So these are ways in which the elite comforts itself. These are ways in which you don't have to feel guilty because this is not our problem. And the way out, what is the way out in Slumdog Millionaire? You win a lottery. That means you have 1 in a million chance of getting out. And so that is the way in which the slum has become a consumer product today. So what you see is very often it's that. It's not, you don't go in there with sympathy or with empathy or with compassion. You go in there because this is what you don't want to see. This is what you're embarrassed about.
And let me thank you very much, both for the film and for the time. Please join me again in thanking Anand Pathwardhan for joining us.